They say a man's past never truly stays buried. But when Reed Carson found that little bulldog lying next to a stinking old pit on the edge of his land, he had no idea it was about to start digging his up. Before we jump into this chilling true story of loyalty, guilt, and a deadly twist you'll never see coming, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Animal Story. We bring you emotional, mysterious, and gripping tales about animals that change lives and sometimes end them. Now, back to Reed and the dog that shouldn't have survived. Reed Carson wasn't what you'd call a people person. In his late 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and a weathered Stetson that hadn't been new since the Bush administration, Reed lived alone on the outskirts of Mesa Ridge, Arizona. He liked it that way. Quiet mornings, coffee on the porch, and the occasional trip into town to stock up on jerky and feed. No pets, no kids, no drama. But that winter morning, something changed. He was out back inspecting the old fence line near the far end of his property, the edge that backed up to what used to be someone else's ranch. The place had been abandoned for years, ever since the previous owner disappeared under shady circumstances. That's when Reed heard it. A faint whimper, muffled, weak. He followed the sound until he reached a shallow pit behind a rotting shed. The smell hit him like a freight train, something foul way beyond animal waste. He almost turned back, but then he saw it. A tiny, shivering bulldog pup, caked in mud, and something darker lying at the edge of the pit. "What in the hell?" he muttered, crouching down. The pup blinked at him, barely moving. One eye swollen, shut, ribs showing, breathing ragged. Reed hesitated. He didn't do pets, especially not dogs. But something about this little thing, the way it looked at him like it knew something he didn't, it stuck with him. So he did something he hadn't done in decades. He cared. He brought it home, cleaned it up, gave it food and a warm blanket inside the barn. Figured if it made it through the night, maybe he'd take it to the vet. Maybe. But the dog he decided to name him Duke was a fighter. In just a few days, Duke was eating solid food, limping around, and giving Reed side-eye like they were old drinking buddies. There was something sharp in the dog's eyes, though. Not anger, not fear, just knowing. Reed didn't talk about the pit. Didn't talk about the fact that he already knew what was buried there, or who. As the days passed, Reed started taking Duke out to the fields with him. The dog stuck close, quiet, and observant. He didn't bark much, but every time they got near that spot, the pit Duke would freeze. His ears would perk up, his nose twitch, and he'd just stand there staring into the dirt. Reed would give a nervous laugh and say something like, "Ain't nothing out there but bad memories, boy." But deep down, he knew better. Because Duke wasn't staring at just any patch of ground. He was staring at a lie. By the second month, Reed Carson had to admit it. He kinda liked having Duke around. The dog didn't bark at shadows or whine like some mutts do. He was calm, watchful, loyal in that quiet way that made a man feel less alone out there on 70 acres of dry, cracking land. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at Reed like a bone he couldn't bury: Duke's obsession with the pit. Every time they passed it on the way to fix a fence, or just walking to the back pasture, the dog would stop dead in his tracks, stare, sniff the air, then slowly lower his head toward the dirt, like he could hear something under there. It made Reed's skin crawl. "You got something against compost, boy," he joked one morning, trying to shake the unease. Duke didn't move. Reed spat on the ground and tugged the leash. "Come on now. Ain't nothing but some old junk back there." But he was lying. Not just to the dog, to himself. That pit wasn't junk. It was a secret. 7 years back, when Reed was younger and meaner, there'd been a man named Dalton Briggs. Drifter, big mouth. Claimed the property line ran through Reed's well, started building a fence on what wasn't his land. One argument turned into 5. Then fists. Then a night with too much whiskey and too many words. Reed didn't mean to hit him that hard, didn't mean to let him bleed out under that Arizona moon, but panic makes people do stupid things. So he dug the hole behind the shed, deep enough, or so he thought, piled trash and old manure on top to mask the scent, told the sheriff Dalton skipped town, probably moved on to Flagstaff, or maybe even New Mexico. No one came looking too hard. The guy had no family. It should have ended there. But Duke was digging up the past, literally. By mid-spring, Reed wasn't sleeping much. He kept dreaming of heavy footsteps outside his window, of shallow breathing beside the bed, of Dalton's voice saying, "You think you're safe. Dirt doesn't forget." He'd wake in cold sweats, Duke curled at the foot of the bed, staring at him with that unnerving stillness. That morning, Reed found the dog, out back, mud-caked paws, teeth-stained reddish-brown, digging again. He'd clawed nearly 2 feet deep. Clumps of foul-smelling dirt covered his face. Reed's chest tightened. "Get away from there!" he barked, stumbling toward the dog. Duke growled, low and sharp. It was the first time he'd ever made a sound like that. "Don't you damn growl at me," Reed snapped. But the look in Duke's eyes, that wasn't fear. That was judgment. Later that night, Reed sat on his porch with a bottle of Jack and a 12-gauge leaning against the wall. "Maybe I should have just left you in that pit," he muttered. Duke didn't flinch. He just sat at the bottom step facing the shed, watching it, waiting for what Reed didn't know. Or maybe he did. Maybe deep down, some part of him always knew the past wouldn't stay buried. And Duke? He wasn't just a dog. He was a witness. Reed didn't talk to many folks, but even the cashier at Hank's Feed and Supply could tell he wasn't right. The man looked worn, like he hadn't slept in days. Deep bags under his eyes, flinching at every sound. "You all right, Mr. Carson?" the girl asked as she rang up his bag of dog food. He didn't answer, just mumbled something about coyotes and left cash on the counter. The truth, it wasn't coyotes keeping him up at night. It was Duke. Back at the ranch, things were getting worse. The dog wasn't acting like himself anymore. His once calm demeanor had shifted. He'd stalk around the yard after dark, circling the shed, nose to the dirt, tail stiff. He'd stopped eating from his bowl, only gnawing at bones he dragged from God knows where. And his eyes? Something had changed. They were too human. Not soft, not warm. Cold, calculating. Reed caught himself avoiding eye contact with the dog like he might see something in those dark pupils he wasn't ready to face. Something that already knew. One night Reed woke to a sound he couldn't place, wet and rhythmic, like something being torn. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. There was Duke, right by the pit. Digging again? But this time, something was poking through the dirt. Reed's heart skipped. He walked over, slow, cautious, the flashlight trembling in his hand. As he got closer, the light caught it, something white and jagged protruding from the loose soil. A bone. Not animal, human. His knees buckled. For a second he thought he might vomit. Then he felt the hot breath behind him. Duke was right there, not barking, not growling, just watching. Reed didn't say a word. He backed away, left the hole as it was, and went back inside, locking the door behind him for the first time in years. He didn't touch the bottle that night. He sat in the dark, shotgun across his lap, curtains drawn, waiting. Around 3 a.m. he heard the scratching. Not outside, inside. Duke was clawing at the back door. Slow, repetitive. Like he knew Reed was watching from the other side. The man finally shouted, "Leave it alone." You don't know what happened. But he did. He always did. That wasn't a dog at the door anymore. It was something older than judgment. It was truth with teeth. By morning, the pit was open wide. The whole top layer scraped clean. And there, half exposed under the desert sun, lay what remained of Dalton Briggs. A skull with a shattered cheekbone, a rotted boot half pulled from the ankle, a rusted belt buckle with the initials DB. Reed collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "I didn't mean to kill him." It just got out of hand. Duke sat across from him, silent, staring, still. And that's when it hit Reed the dog wasn't looking at the bones. He was looking at him, like the bones were just the warm-up, like justice hadn't been served yet. Reed tried to rebury the bones. At dawn, hands shaking sweat pouring down his back, he shoveled dirt over Dalton Briggs like he was trying to erase the past all over again. But the earth didn't take kindly to lies. Every scoop of dry soil felt heavier than the last, like the land itself was fighting him. And all the while, Duke just sat nearby, watching. The same way he'd watched for weeks now, calm, unmoving, like a preacher waiting for a confession. When Reed was done, he slumped against the shed wall, gasping for air. Duke stood, took a slow step forward, and growled low. Not loud. Just enough to say, "I saw that." Reed tried to go back to normal. He tossed Duke a steak from the freezer. The dog didn't touch it. He drove into town, tried to grab a beer at McKinley's bar, but the chatter made his skin crawl. Every laugh felt like it was aimed at him. Every set of eyes, even strangers, felt like they knew. So he left. Back on the ranch, he locked the doors, nailed shut the back window, took to sleeping in the recliner with the shotgun pointed at the front door. Just in case. Duke didn't bark, didn't pace. He just stayed close. Closer than ever. Like he was waiting for something to snap. Maybe he was. It got worse on the third night. Reed woke to the sound of breathing in the living room. Heavy. Wet. But when he opened his eyes, there was no one there, just Duke sitting in the corner. His eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and for one horrible second, Reed saw something behind them. Not just the shine of a dog's gaze, but the weight of something ancient. Something patient. Reed whispered, "You ain't just a dog, are you?" Duke didn't move. The next morning, Reed found claw marks on the inside of the barn door. Deep, deliberate scratches like someone had tried to spell something. 4 letters. Over and over. Guilty! He stumbled back, fell into the dirt. No, he muttered, no, no, no. But the evidence was everywhere. Duke had dragged Dalton's belt buckle to the front steps, dropped it at the door like an offering, or a warning. Reed lost it. He picked up the buckle and hurled it into the desert, screamed after it like the sound could drown out his guilt. Then he turned to Duke. "Why are you doing this to me?" Duke didn't flinch, just stared. Reed didn't sleep that night. He poured gasoline around the pit, lit a match. Flames danced high smoke rising like a ghost from the earth. He stood there, watching it burn, his face soaked with sweat and regret. "If I go down," he muttered, "I'm taking you with me." But when he turned around, Duke was gone. By sunrise, the fire was out, but the pit still there, still open, the bones untouched by flame. And on the porch, right where Reed had once laid out a blanket for that half-dead pup, there sat Dalton's rusted belt buckle, cleaned, polished, waiting. By the end of that week, Reed Carson wasn't a man anymore. He was a shell. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His shotgun stayed across his lap like a crutch, and his eyes were red from too much whiskey and too little sleep. The ranch, once quiet and solid, now felt like it was holding its breath. The pit never closed. Duke never left. The final straw came just after midnight. Reed had dozed off in the chair again, heart-pounding dreams chasing him through that same hellish loop, Dalton Briggs gasping for air, blood pooling in the moonlight, and Duke sitting in the shadows, like a judge in a courtroom no one could see. When he woke, the front door was wide open. Wind howled through the house, carrying the smell of burning dirt, and something else. Something rotting. He stumbled to his feet, shotgun in hand, and stepped onto the porch. And there he was, Duke, sitting at the edge of the pit facing him. But something had changed. The dog looked taller, broader. The eyes, once canine, now shimmered with something Reed couldn't explain, like a storm trapped in glass. And behind him in the pit, the dirt had shifted again. A hand. A human hand, half-exposed, bony fingers clawing at the air. Reed raised the shotgun. "Back off," he shouted. "This ain't your business." Duke didn't move. Reed's finger hovered on the trigger. "Damn dog, I gave you a home, I saved you." And then quietly, so quiet, he barely heard it. Reed swore. Duke growled something that sounded like words. Not barking, not snarling, but whispering. "You can't bury what you never faced." Reed dropped the shotgun. He fell to his knees, hands shaking. "I didn't mean to kill him. It was a fight, that's all it was. I panicked. I didn't have a choice." The wind stopped. The desert went still. Duke stepped forward, and Reed saw it clear as day, Dalton Briggs's reflection in the dog's eyes. The old man wept. He crawled to the pit, whispering apologies into the dust. "I'll confess," he said. "I'll call the sheriff. I'll tell them everything. Just let me go." Duke sat by his side, closer than he'd ever been. Then slowly he placed one heavy paw on Reed's chest, and pushed. Reed lost his balance. He tumbled into the pit, landing in the soft, rotting soil beside the man he had buried. For one brief second he thought Duke would follow, but the dog just stood above him, staring down. Then he turned and walked away into the rising light of dawn. They found Reed's body 3 days later after a local deputy came looking for him over missed payments. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but locals whispered about the pit, about the bones, about the dog. The deputy swore he saw paw prints in the dirt leading away from the grave, but none leading in. Some say Duke still roams the high desert. Not quite alive, not quite animal. A creature drawn to guilt like a magnet, sniffing out secrets buried under lies, waiting by shallow graves for the living to confess or be pulled under. And if you ever find a pit in the middle of nowhere and a dog watching you from the shadows, be honest, because the dirt never forgets, and neither does he. It's been nearly 5 years since they found Reed Carson's body lying in that shallow grave beside the skeleton of Dalton Briggs. 5 years, and the townspeople still talk about it, usually in hushed voices, over late-night coffee or cheap beers at McKinley's bar. They say the desert claimed him. Others say karma did. But the strangest part, nobody ever found the dog. Not a trace. No paw prints. No fur. Not even a collar. Duke vanished like a ghost when the truth finally surfaced. The sheriff's office cleaned up the site. The pit was filled and fenced off. They even put up a small wooden cross where Dalton's remains were buried properly. Reed was laid to rest next to his late wife on the opposite end of town, though few people showed up to that funeral. Most folks didn't know what to make of it. Some called it poetic justice. Others blamed the heat isolation and years of guilt weighing on Reed's mind. But there were always a few who believed Duke wasn't just a dog, that maybe he was something older. Something sent to balance the scales when law and conscience failed. A couple months after the incident, a rancher over in Dry Creek swore he saw a bulldog sitting on the edge of his property, right beside an old well that had been sealed shut for decades. He tried to approach. The dog just stared, then turned, and disappeared into the desert. When the rancher told the story later, folks chuckled. But a week later, they found something in that well. Bones, old ones. Another story buried in silence. Now there's a kind of legend growing around Duke, at least among the old-timers and truckers who still pass through Mesa Ridge. They say if you see him, you better come clean about whatever sin you've been hiding. Because once he's sniffed out your truth, you don't get to keep it buried for long. Some even call him the Guilt Hound. They say his eyes don't just see, they remember. These days, new folks drive through that dusty stretch of road on the edge of town and wonder why there's a handmade sign nailed to a post with faded black paint. No trespassing, no digging, and for God's sake, don't feed the dog. They think it's a joke, but the locals, they just nod and look away. And so the question becomes, do you believe that guilt can take shape? That it can walk on 4 legs, wait by old crimes, and return when it's time to settle the debt? Because the truth has a way of crawling out of the dirt, sometimes with claws, sometimes with teeth, and sometimes with eyes that never blink. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Duke was just a dog, or something else entirely? Tell us in the comments below. And if you love dark, emotional, and mysterious stories about the deep bond and danger between animals and people, be sure to subscribe to Animal Story for more tales like this one. Because not all stories end when the ground is filled. Some are just beginning.